Christmas dinner came to a standstill when the house phone rang. Dad barely looked up from carving the turkey. "Probably your aunt calling again," he muttered, wiping his hands on a napkin before picking up the receiver. "Hello." His expression stayed, relaxed for exactly 2 seconds. Then every trace of color drained from his face. "What?" The fork slipped from Mom's hand and clattered onto her plate. Dad swallowed hard. "You mean," his voice cracked. He looked directly across the table at me. "My daughter." Nobody moved. My older sister slowly lowered her glass. Grandpa, who had been quietly cutting his food moments earlier, didn't even look surprised. Dad listened in complete silence, his knuckles turning white around the receiver. "No, that can't be right." Another long pause. "I understand." He glanced at me again, this time with an expression I'd never seen before. Fear. Real fear. The room became so quiet that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Nobody understood why one phone call had shattered my father's confidence. 5 months earlier, he had been absolutely certain he had destroyed my future. He had no idea someone else had been watching. 5 months earlier, I walked through the front door clutching the paper that had taken me nearly 4 years to earn. My SAT score. 1490. I had checked it so many times on the school website that morning, I could practically recite every section's score from memory. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine my parents smiling at me. Maybe this would finally be enough. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table sorting grocery coupons while Dad read the newspaper. "I got my SAT results," I said, unable to keep the excitement out of my voice. Dad folded one corner of the paper down. "What'd you get?" 1490. He stared at me for a moment. I waited. Mom didn't even ask to see the paper. Instead, she laughed. A short, dismissive laugh. "Well," she said, returning to her coupons, "save the college money for your sister. She actually needs the help." My smile disappeared. I'm not asking you to pay for college." Dad lowered his newspaper. "What do you mean?" "I've spent months applying for scholarships. Most of them are merit-based. I just need your signatures on a few financial forms." Mom waved her hand, as if brushing away an annoying fly. "Too much paperwork." "It isn't that much." Dad leaned back in his chair. "No." I blinked. "No. No signatures." I swallowed. "But those forms are required." "They're your problem." I stood there holding my score report while the silence stretched across the kitchen. Finally, I said quietly, "Then I'll finish everything else myself." Neither of them answered. Over the next several weeks, I worked after everyone went to bed. Scholarship essays, recommendation requests, volunteer records, transcripts, financial worksheets, application packets. Every completed folder brought me one step closer to a future I was determined to build without asking my parents for tuition. I carefully organized everything inside a large blue binder and hid it beneath my bed. I thought no one would ever find it. I was wrong. One Saturday afternoon, I came home from my shift at the grocery store and froze in the hallway. The binder sat open on the kitchen table. Dad was flipping through my scholarship applications. Mom stood beside him, reading one of my essays aloud in a mocking voice. "Education creates opportunity," she read dramatically before laughing. "Listen to this." My sister leaned against the counter, watching without saying a word. I rushed forward. "Please don't touch those." Dad ignored me. "So these are the scholarships you've been hiding." "They aren't hidden. You've been wasting your time." "I'm trying to earn my own education." Mom folded her arms. "And we're trying to make sure your sister has one." I reached for the binder. Dad pulled it away. "I paid for this printer. I bought the paper with my own paycheck." "It doesn't matter." He picked up the first application. Without warning, he tore it straight down the middle. The ripping sound echoed through the kitchen. Dad. Another application. Rip. Then another. Rip. No, please stop. I reached for the papers, but he kept tearing them apart, page after page. Recommendation letters. Personal essays. Acceptance forms. Volunteer certificates. Months of work became piles of shredded paper, drifting onto the kitchen floor. Mom watched calmly. Dreams don't feed families, Jessy. I dropped to my knees, trying to gather the pieces before they scattered farther. Tears blurred the words I'd spent months writing. Then my sister quietly picked up the small envelope beside the binder. The one containing the money I'd saved from my grocery job for scholarship application fees. She looked at Mom. Mom nodded once. My sister slipped the envelope into her own backpack. Nobody stopped her. Nobody apologized. Nobody even looked uncomfortable. When they finally walked away, I stayed on the kitchen floor gathering scraps that could never be put back together. Outside the open kitchen window, a pickup truck slowed to a stop. Grandpa had come by to return a toolbox Dad had forgotten after helping repair his fence. He stepped out carrying the red metal toolbox. Before reaching the front door, voices drifted through the open window. He couldn't hear every word, but he heard enough. He saw me kneeling on the floor. He saw shredded papers scattered around me. He saw Dad standing over me. Grandpa stood perfectly still for several seconds. Then, without knocking, he quietly placed the toolbox beside the porch, turned around, and drove away. I never knew he'd been there. The next morning, Grandpa called. His voice sounded gentle. Jessy. Morning, Grandpa. I just have one question. What is it? There was a long pause. Then he quietly asked, Did you really give up on college? I forced a smile, even though Grandpa couldn't see it through the phone. Yeah, I answered softly. I changed my mind. The silence on the other end lasted just a little too long. Did you? I stared out the kitchen window. I just realized college isn't the only path. Jessy. His voice wasn't accusing. It was careful. I've known you since the day you were born. I know. You've wanted to go to college since you were 10. I swallowed. People change. No, Grandpa said gently. Sometimes circumstances change. I closed my eyes. If I keep pushing this, it's only going to make things worse at home. So you're protecting the peace. I guess. For whose benefit? I couldn't answer. Grandpa let the silence settle instead of filling it. Finally, he asked, Do you still have your scholarship essays? My fingers tightened around the phone. No. You deleted them. I threw everything away. All of it. Yes. Another pause. Then he simply said, All right. He didn't argue. He didn't pressure me. He only added, If you ever decide you want to tell me the truth, you already know I'll listen. When the call ended, I sat motionless for several minutes. It was the first time someone had questioned my story instead of accepting it. Life at home moved on as though nothing important had happened. Mom spent evenings browsing university websites with my sister. What about this campus? She asked one night, sliding her laptop across the table. My sister barely looked. It's too far. Dad nodded thoughtfully. We'll schedule visits, maybe 3 or 4 schools. What about housing? Mom asked. We'll make it work. They discussed tuition, dormitories, meal plans, parking permits, travel expenses, thousands of dollars. The same people who insisted there wasn't enough money for a single scholarship application fee suddenly found endless resources when the conversation centered on my sister. I quietly carried my dinner plate to the sink. Nobody noticed me leaving the room. Since college no longer seemed possible, I picked up extra hours at the grocery store. Morning shifts during weekends. Evening shifts after school. Whenever someone called in sick, I volunteered. My manager looked surprised. "Jessy, you've been here almost every day." "I don't mind. You should be enjoying senior year." I smiled politely. "I'm saving." "For college?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated. "For whatever comes next." During my lunch breaks, I sat alone in the break room searching community colleges on my phone. Tuition, financial aid, part-time programs, anything that might be possible without my parents' signatures. Every option seemed farther away than the last. Still, I refused to stop looking. The following week, my guidance counselor, Mr. Reynolds, called me into his office. Stacks of college brochures covered his desk. He smiled as I walked in. "I've been trying to reach you." "I'm sorry, I've been working." He nodded. "Your scholarship files disappeared from our submission list." I looked down. "I withdrew them." His forehead creased. "Why?" "My family has other priorities." "Jessy, my sister needs the support more." He leaned back slowly. "I've read your essays." I looked up. They were some of the strongest applications this school has seen. I forced another smile. "It doesn't matter anymore." "It matters to me." I shook my head. "My decision's already made." He studied my face for several seconds. "You don't sound like someone who made this decision." I stood. "I should get back to class." He didn't stop me. But as I reached the door, he quietly said, "If you ever need someone to tell the truth to, my door stays open." I nodded without turning around. That evening, Mr. Reynolds couldn't shake the conversation. Jessy had never quit anything. Not debate. Not student council. Not volunteer tutoring. Certainly not college. He logged into the school's application system to finish paperwork for graduating seniors. Jessy's folder was still archived. Curious, he opened it. Every scholarship essay was still there. Every recommendation letter. Every transcript request. Every document carried timestamps stretching back over 6 months. The final activity occurred just 3 days before she claimed to have changed her mind. He frowned. That timeline didn't make sense. If she'd willingly abandoned college, why had she continued perfecting every application until the very end? Something wasn't adding up. Then he remembered something else. Grandpa Carter, a longtime member of the school's Alumni Advisory Board. A man who had personally funded scholarships for students over the years. Mr. Reynolds picked up the phone. The following afternoon, Grandpa sat quietly in the counselor's office. Mr. Reynolds slid a folder across the desk. "I normally wouldn't share this." Grandpa looked down at the printed essays. His granddaughter's handwriting filled the margins with revisions. Careful notes. Corrections. Deadlines. Hope. "She told me she threw everything away," Grandpa said quietly. "She didn't." Mr. Reynolds opened another file. "These are system logs." Grandpa adjusted his glasses. Every saved draft. Every upload. Every revision. The dates showed months of relentless work. Then, nothing. An abrupt stop. No submissions. No withdrawals initiated by Jessy herself. Just silence. Grandpa slowly removed his glasses. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I don't think my granddaughter gave up." Mr. Reynolds nodded. "I don't either." Grandpa stared at the papers for a long moment before reaching for his phone. He stepped into the hallway. A single call. One person. When they answered, he spoke only one sentence. I think my granddaughter is protecting the people hurting her. Senior awards night was supposed to be one of the happiest evenings of the school year. Parents filled the auditorium. Students adjusted graduation gowns behind the stage. Teachers smiled as they arranged stacks of certificates and scholarship envelopes. Jessy stood with the other seniors, smoothing the wrinkles from her borrowed blazer. One of her classmates nudged her. "You ready?" Jessy smiled politely. "For what?" "You." He laughed. "They're probably going to call your name 10 times tonight." Another student joined in. "Seriously, if anybody's sweeping the scholarships, it's Jessy." Jessy forced a small smile, but said nothing. She already knew they wouldn't call her name. The principal stepped to the microphone. "Our first academic scholarship." Applause erupted as another student walked across the stage. Then another scholarship. Another winner. Another round of applause. Jessy clapped for every classmate. She kept waiting. Then the largest academic award was announced. The room grew quiet. Several teachers glanced toward Jessy before the envelope was opened. Instead, a different name echoed through the auditorium. A murmur spread through the audience. "What? I thought that was Jessy's. Didn't she apply? I heard she had one of the highest SAT scores." Even the scholarship presenter hesitated before continuing. Jessy kept clapping. She refused to let anyone see her disappointment. By the end of the ceremony, every scholarship had been awarded. Her name had never been called. After the ceremony ended, clusters of parents and students filled the lobby. Mr. Reynolds was congratulating scholarship recipients when two representatives from separate scholarship foundations approached him. One carried a clipboard. The other looked genuinely confused. "Can we ask you something?" "Of course." "What happened to Jessy Carter?" Mr. Reynolds frowned. "What do you mean?" "She was one of our strongest applicants." The second representative nodded. "We were waiting for her final submission package. It never arrived. We assumed she'd accepted another award." Mr. Reynolds felt his stomach tighten. "No." She withdrew. Both representatives exchanged puzzled looks. "That doesn't make sense. Her essays were exceptional, and her recommendations were among the strongest we received. If she'd completed the process, she would have been highly competitive." Mr. Reynolds thanked them quietly. His concern deepened. Across the lobby, Jessy's parents were surrounded by relatives. Mom smiled confidently. Jessy decided college wasn't really for her. One aunt looked surprised. "Really?" Dad nodded. "She wants to work instead." Another cousin frowned. "With a 1490 SAT." Mom shrugged dramatically. "Academics aren't everything." We didn't pressure her. It was completely her choice. Jessy stood several feet away pretending to read the awards program. Every word reached her. Not one relative questioned the story. Most simply nodded. Some even praised her parents. That's very understanding. Every child has different dreams. Jessy lowered her eyes. For the second time in her life, someone else was writing her future. Near the exit doors, Grandpa quietly approached Mr. Reynolds. "You asked me to stay." The counselor nodded. "I have something you need to see." He led Grandpa into a small conference room beside the auditorium. Without speaking, he placed several folders on the table. Printed scholarship essays, recommendation letters, submission timelines, email confirmations, application checklists. Every page carried dates. Every document proved months of preparation. Grandpa turned each page slowly. His expression became harder with every document. Mr. Reynolds opened another folder. These emails were exchanged less than a week before everything stopped. Grandpa read Jessy's messages. thanking teachers, confirming deadlines, requesting transcripts. She had been fully committed. Then, nothing. No goodbye emails. No withdrawal notices. No explanation. The work simply ended. She didn't quit, Grandpa said quietly. No. Mr. Reynolds shook his head. Something interrupted her. Grandpa closed the folder. I believe I know what. The following Monday, Grandpa met his longtime attorney, Charles Whitmore. Charles had handled the Carter family's legal matters for nearly 25 years. After reviewing every document, he looked up. This isn't normal. No. Grandpa folded his hands. I need answers. Charles began quietly contacting scholarship foundations. Every representative told the same story. Jessy's application process had simply stopped. No requests for extensions. No withdrawal letters. Nothing. Then Charles contacted several teachers. Each confirmed the same thing. Jessy had spent months preparing. One teacher even produced handwritten notes from essay conferences. Everything pointed in one direction. Deliberate interference. Still, evidence mattered. Not assumptions. 3 weeks later, Charles tracked down the technician who had serviced the Carter family's home printer. The man checked his repair records. I remember that house. Charles leaned forward. Why? The printer wasn't broken. It was jammed. How? The technician shrugged. Someone shoved half-printed documents into every paper path. On purpose. I've repaired printers for 18 years. He nodded confidently. That wasn't an accident. Charles requested a written statement. The technician signed it immediately. By the end of the investigation, every independent piece of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. Jessy's scholarship applications hadn't failed. They had been intentionally stopped. Grandpa never confronted his son. Not once. He never raised his voice. He never accused anyone. Instead, he walked into Charles Whitmore's office carrying a leather folder. Charles spread several legal documents across the desk. Grandpa signed each one carefully. When the final page was complete, Charles asked quietly, Are you certain? Grandpa didn't hesitate. I've never been more certain. Charles gathered the papers. They'll never be able to interfere with her education again. Grandpa looked directly at him. Good. He slid the final document across the desk. Make sure her parents never get the chance to destroy her future again. 5 months passed. The acceptance letters I had once dreamed about never arrived. Not because I wasn't qualified. Because they had never been given the chance to. By December, I had stopped checking my email every morning. Stopped refreshing scholarship portals. Stopped wondering what might have happened. I graduated from high school, increased my hours at the grocery store, and quietly accepted that my future would have to wait. Whenever customers asked what college I planned to attend, I smiled politely. I'm taking some time to work first. It became easier than explaining the truth. Christmas morning arrived with the same traditions our family followed every year. Mom insisted everyone dress nicely. Dad spent hours preparing the turkey. Relatives filled the house by noon. Laughter echoed through every room. If anyone looked closely, they would have noticed one difference. I spoke very little. Not because I was angry. Because I had finally stopped expecting anyone at that table to understand me. As everyone settled into their seats, Mom stood and lifted her glass. I have an announcement. The room quieted. She smiled proudly at my sister. We've officially committed almost all of our college savings to Emily. My sister smiled awkwardly. Mom continued. We know investing in one child's future is expensive, but she's shown so much potential. Several relatives applauded. One uncle raised his glass. Congratulations. Another aunt smiled. You must be relieved to have everything figured out. Dad nodded proudly. It wasn't easy. We had to make sacrifices. Mom looked toward me for only a moment. But every family has to make difficult choices. I quietly took another bite of mashed potatoes. Nobody asked what sacrifices had been made. Nobody asked whose future had been traded away. The front door opened. Grandpa stepped inside, carrying a neatly wrapped gift. He looked thinner than I remembered. His movements were slower. Mom immediately stood. Dad, you're late. Traffic. He smiled faintly before hugging everyone. When he reached me, he held the embrace a second longer than usual. Merry Christmas, sweetheart. Merry Christmas. You look tired. I've been working. I know. He squeezed my shoulder gently. I'm proud of you. The words caught me off guard. No one else at the table had said anything like that in months. Grandpa quietly took his seat without another word. Throughout dinner, he spoke very little. Instead, he watched. He noticed every glance, every interruption, every time someone praised my sister while speaking over me. He said nothing. Unknown to everyone else, Grandpa had spent part of the previous month recovering from a minor heart procedure. During those quiet days in the hospital, he had finalized every legal document Charles Whitmore prepared. Every signature had been witnessed. Every instruction had been reviewed twice. Every safeguard had been added. He wasn't rushing because he expected the worst. He was making certain that no matter what happened to him, nobody could undo what he had put in place. Not even his own son. Halfway through dinner, Grandpa's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Then he quietly stood. Excuse me for a minute. He stepped into the hallway. Nobody paid much attention. Dad continued carving turkey. Mom began discussing Emily's spring semester plans. So we'll visit the campus after New Year's, she said. Emily nodded. I'll need furniture for the dorm. We've already budgeted for that, Dad replied. And a new laptop. We'll get one. I listened silently. The conversation sounded strangely familiar. Months earlier, those dreams had belonged to me. Now it was as though they had never existed. Less than 2 minutes later, the house phone rang. Dad laughed. Must be another Christmas call. He wiped his hands and picked up the receiver. Carter residence. His smile disappeared almost immediately. Oh, yes. The room slowly grew quiet. I understand. His eyes shifted toward Grandpa, who had just returned from the hallway. You mean? He swallowed hard. Is my daughter. Mom frowned. What is it? Dad didn't answer. Instead, he listened. Longer. Longer still. Finally, he spoke again. You're requesting speakerphone. His voice sounded uncertain now. All right. He pressed the button with trembling fingers. A calm, professional voice filled the dining room. This is Charles Whitmore, attorney for Harold Carter. Several relatives exchanged confused glances. Grandpa calmly returned to his chair. He folded his hands as though he had been expecting this exact moment. Charles continued. Mr. Carter requested that this notification be delivered in the presence of immediate family. Nobody spoke. Mom looked between Grandpa and Dad. What notification? Charles ignored the interruption. I will now read portions of the executed legal instructions concerning Miss Jessy Carter's education trust and amendments to Mr. Harold Carter's estate plan. Dad's breathing became noticeably heavier. Mom laughed nervously. Education trust. There must be some mistake. Charles's tone remained steady. There is no mistake. Another page turned. The documents before me were created following an independent investigation into evidence indicating intentional interference with Miss Jessy Carter's educational opportunities. The dining room fell completely silent. Every relative looked toward my parents, then toward me, then back to Grandpa. Nobody knew what to say. Grandpa met my eyes for just a moment. His expression was calm, certain. He looked back toward the phone. Then, in a quiet voice that carried through the entire room, he said only 4 words. "Keep reading, Charles." Charles Whitmore's voice remained calm and measured over the speakerphone. "I will summarize the findings that led to Mr. Harold Carter's legal decisions." Nobody at the table moved. The only sound in the dining room was the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Charles continued. "Over the past 5 months, I conducted an independent review at Mr. Carter's request regarding Miss Jessy Carter's discontinued scholarship applications." Dad's jaw tightened. Mom folded her arms. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. Grandpa didn't even look at her. "Please continue, Charles." Another page turned. "Our investigation included interviews with school administrators, scholarship organizations, faculty members, and other relevant witnesses." Charles paused briefly before continuing. "We also reviewed application timelines, digital records, recommendation requests, and supporting documentation." I stared at Grandpa. He never once looked away from the phone. Charles began listing the evidence one piece at a time. Miss Jessy Carter completed multiple scholarship essays over several months. "I can confirm," Mr. Reynolds, her guidance counselor, stated in a signed affidavit, "that Jessy remained actively engaged in scholarship preparation until the week her submissions unexpectedly stopped." Charles continued. Recommendation letters had already been requested. Academic transcripts had been prepared. Volunteer hours had been verified. Multiple scholarship committees confirmed that Miss Carter had been considered among their strongest prospective applicants before her application process abruptly ceased. Mom shifted uncomfortably. Dad remained completely still. Charles continued reading. "Our review found no evidence that Miss Carter voluntarily abandoned her educational plans. Instead, we found overwhelming evidence that she intended to complete every application." My aunt slowly lowered her fork. "So, she never quit?" Nobody answered. Charles turned to another document. "Additionally, we obtained written statements concerning the events surrounding the destruction of Miss Carter's scholarship materials." Dad finally spoke. "That's enough." His voice sounded strained. "You don't know what you're talking about." Charles answered immediately. "I do, Mr. Carter." The room became even quieter. "We possess statements confirming that scholarship materials were deliberately destroyed before submission." Dad looked toward Grandpa. "You hired someone to investigate your own family." Grandpa answered without hesitation. "I hired someone to protect my granddaughter." Mom slammed her hand against the table. "You believed strangers over your own son." Grandpa's expression never changed. "I believed evidence." Charles continued. "The investigation also confirmed that the household printer required professional repair immediately following the destruction of scholarship documents." Dad's face tightened. Charles read directly from the technician's written statement. The printer had been intentionally jammed with partially printed scholarship paperwork. In my professional opinion, this damage was deliberate. Several relatives slowly turned toward my parents. Nobody looked confused anymore. My cousin whispered, "Oh my God." One uncle quietly asked, "Is that true?" Dad opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Mom looked away. For the first time in years. Neither of them had an explanation. Charles moved to the next section. "Based upon these findings, Mr. Harold Carter elected not to confront the responsible parties immediately. Instead, he chose to secure Miss Jessy Carter's future before informing anyone of his decision. Grandpa finally spoke. I knew arguing wouldn't change what had already happened. He looked directly at my parents. But protecting her future still could. Charles continued. An irrevocable education trust has been established solely for Miss Jessy Carter. It covers undergraduate tuition, campus housing, books, required educational materials, reasonable living expenses, and if she chooses, graduate or professional school. I stared at Grandpa. I couldn't speak. Charles wasn't finished. The trust further specifies that neither parent shall possess authority to approve, deny, redirect, borrow, supervise, or otherwise influence any educational funds belonging to Miss Jessy Carter. Dad's chair scraped loudly across the floor as he stood. You cut us out. Grandpa answered calmly. No. I removed the opportunity for you to hurt her again. My throat tightened. Grandpa. He finally turned toward me. I wasn't impressed because you earned a 1490. I blinked. I was impressed because after everything they did, you still kept trying. His voice softened. You worked. You studied. You looked for another path. You never stopped acting with integrity. I felt tears welling in my eyes. I thought I'd lost everything. Grandpa smiled gently. No. You lost paper. They never took your character. For months, I had convinced myself that crying would make me look weak. Now I couldn't stop. Not because my future had suddenly changed. Because someone had finally believed me without asking me to prove I deserved compassion. Grandpa stood and wrapped his arms around me. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. Charles cleared his throat. There remains one additional amendment. Dad slowly sat back down. What now? Effective immediately, Mr. Daniel Carter has been removed as executor of Harold Carter's estate. Dad's eyes widened. What? The role has been reassigned to an independent fiduciary. Mom stared at Grandpa. You don't trust your own son. Grandpa answered quietly. I don't trust anyone who destroys opportunity for another child. Charles continued. The remaining provisions of the estate remain confidential until such time as they become legally operative. Dad lowered his head. For the first time in my life, he had nothing to control. The silence didn't last long. My aunt spoke first. Jessy. She looked heartbroken. I believed you didn't want college. So did I, another uncle admitted. We should have asked you. One by one, relatives apologized. Not because Grandpa had embarrassed them. Because they realized how easily they had accepted a lie without ever speaking to the person it affected most. Then everyone looked toward Emily. My sister had barely touched her dinner. She slowly set down her fork. I knew the applications existed. Nobody interrupted. I saw Dad tear them up. She looked at me. I should have stopped him. Her voice cracked. I should have given you back your application money. She reached into her purse. I still have it. She placed an envelope on the table. I looked at it, then gently pushed it back. It's not about the money anymore. Emily nodded, tears filling her eyes. I know. 3 weeks later, I received a phone call from the university admissions office. My guidance counselor had preserved every document in my student file. Because my application materials had already been prepared, the university allowed me to complete a deferred admission process for the upcoming semester. The education trust immediately covered every expense. Tuition, housing, books, orientation fees. Everything. For the first time in months. Planning for college no longer felt like pretending. It felt real. Move-in day arrived beneath a bright blue sky. Grandpa insisted on driving. His old pickup truck was filled with suitcases, bedding, and boxes of school supplies. When we reached the residence hall, he carefully lifted one final box from the truck. Inside was my laptop, the same one I had used to write every scholarship essay. The same one I thought represented a dream that had been destroyed forever. Grandpa handed it to me with a smile. This belongs where it always should have. Together, we carried the last box into my dorm room. No arguments. No permission required. No one standing in the doorway, telling me my future belonged to someone else. I looked out across the campus. Students hurried between buildings, laughing as they greeted new roommates. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to imagine what came next. I turned to Grandpa. He smiled proudly. So, ready to begin. I smiled back, more certain than I had ever been. Yes. I looked once more across the campus before quietly saying, they destroyed my applications, but they couldn't destroy the future I earned.